Speaking of Venezuela, oil, what are we going to do with the oil that we have?
Going to do with what?
The oil that has been seized. The United States seized 1.9 million barrels of oil on December 10th.
We're going to keep it. We're keeping it.
Where's it going? Are we going to sell it or put it in the strategic
Maybe
oil
we'll sell
reserve?
it. Maybe we'll keep it. Maybe we'll use it in the strategic reserves. We're keeping it. We're keeping the ships also. Yeah, please.
The last door has just slammed shut, not metaphorically, not rhetorically, institutionally. For the first time in modern American history, the full machinery of the legislative state has been weaponized against a former executive, not by his ideological enemies, but by his own party. And while the headlines scream about Donald Trump, prison sentences, and political betrayal, almost everyone is missing the real story unfolding underneath the spectacle. Because this is not just about one man losing his freedom. It's about a quiet but profound restructuring of power, one that will long outlive Trump, and one that fundamentally changes the relationship between Congress, the presidency, the courts, the markets, and you. You may have seen the alerts flash across your phone. Executive Accountability Act passes. The summaries are neat. The framing is clean. The emotional cue is obvious. Justice has finally caught up to power. But that story is far too simple. And simplicity in moments like this is usually a lie. What actually happened today was not the end of an era. It was a transition from one unstable form of governance to another, colder one. A shift away from chaotic populism and toward something far more controlled, far more procedural, and far more dangerous in the long run. Because the system didn't just punish Trump. It changed the rules so he could never come back. And in doing so, it changed the rules for everyone. Let's strip away the noise and talk about the mechanics. At the center of today's earthquake is a single idea, that certain crimes are now beyond mercy. The Executive Accountability Act forbids any future president from issuing a pardon for acts defined as betrayal of the Constitution. That phrase sounds righteous, patriotic even, but it's also doing an astonishing amount of work. Historically, the presidential pardon has been absolute. It is one of the oldest and most controversial powers in the American system, inherited from royal prerogative and deliberately preserved as a fail-safe against a rigid or politicized judiciary. It was never meant to be fair. It was meant to be final. The pardon exists because the founders understood something deeply uncomfortable, that law, left unchecked, can become a weapon. And so they placed mercy above the courts. Not because rulers are benevolent, but because systems need escape hatches. What Congress has done here is unprecedented. They did not abolish the pardon outright. That would require a constitutional amendment and years of political struggle. Instead, they did something far more clever. They redefined the crime itself. By carving out betrayal of the Constitution as a category that exists outside the normal jurisdiction of executive mercy, the legislature has asserted the power to define which crimes are politically unforgivable, not just legally punishable. On paper, this looks like accountability. In practice, it is a fundamental rewrite of separation of powers. Congress has told the presidency, there are acts for which no future executive can save you. That is not a minor adjustment. That is a structural shift. Now ask yourself the uncomfortable question, why now? Why is this happening at this moment? And why is it being led, quietly but decisively, by the same political apparatus that spent years enabling the behavior it now claims to be horrified by? This was not a sudden moral awakening. It was a liquidation. To understand this, you have to stop thinking like a voter and start thinking like a balance sheet. For years, Donald Trump functioned as a high-yield, high-risk asset for the Republican establishment. He delivered tax cuts. He reshaped the judiciary. He energized a base. He broke norms that donors were happy to see broken, as long as the returns kept flowing. But over time, the volatility became too expensive. Markets hate unpredictability. Capital hates chaos. Supply chains hate tantrums. International finance hates leaders who threaten to rip up trade agreements or pull out of military alliances on instinct. At a certain point, Trump stopped being an asset and became a liability, not morally, but functionally. And when an asset turns toxic, institutions don't hesitate. They don't argue ideology. They don't debate loyalty. They cut losses. That is what happened today. The Executive Accountability Act didn't just put a man behind bars. It structurally foreclosed the possibility of his return. It placed the Trump phenomenon into receivership and liquidated it to stabilize the broader system. This wasn't punishment. It was risk management. But here is where the story stops being about Trump and starts being about you. When the state changes the rules of the game to eliminate a specific individual, even one many people despise, it creates a mechanism that does not disappear when the target is gone. It remains. Today, betrayal of the Constitution is framed as attempting to overturn an election. Tomorrow, that definition can shift. It can expand. It can be reinterpreted by a hostile Congress with very different priorities. Could organizing a nationwide general strike be framed as destabilizing constitutional order? Could mass civil disobedience against infrastructure projects be defined as an existential threat to the state? Could a future executive's attempt to declare a climate emergency be retroactively labeled abuse of power? Once the legislature claims the authority to define which crimes are unforgivable and removes the possibility of mercy, the law stops being a safeguard and becomes a sentence generator. This effectively creates life imprisonment by policy, not through courts, not through sentencing guidelines, but through politics. And that should unsettle anyone who understands how quickly power changes hands. Trump's legal strategy depended on the same assumption that has protected elites for generations, that no matter how bad things get, the escape hatch always opens. That is how American power works. Banks collapse under fraud. They get bailouts, financial pardons. CEOs destroy companies. They get golden parachutes, corporate pardons. War crimes, immunity, criminal negligence, settlements. The pardon power is simply the legal expression of a broader truth. In this system, some people are too big to fail. What makes today so destabilizing is not that the system enforced accountability. It's that it decided, for once, not to extend mercy to one of its own, not because of morality, because of cost. Trump wasn't too corrupt to save. He was too disruptive, and that distinction matters more than most people realize. This moment is being sold to you as closure, as a victory for the Constitution, as the end of a nightmare. But what actually happened is that the ruling class ejected one of its members to protect the structure itself, while leaving every underlying condition intact. No laws were passed to remove money from politics. No structural reforms were enacted to prevent authoritarian figures from rising again. No protections were strengthened for voters, workers, or institutions. A cage was built. For one problem, that isn't a cure, it's triage. And triage only tells you one thing with certainty: the patient isn't healthy. What makes this moment truly unsettling isn't just what the law does, but how it was done. This wasn't a months-long constitutional debate broadcast on C-SPAN. There were no dramatic floor speeches wrestling with first principles. There was no national referendum on whether Congress should have the power to create crimes that sit beyond executive mercy. Instead, this was procedural warfare. The Executive Accountability Act did not move through Congress as a standalone moral crusade. It was threaded, almost invisibly, into a must-pass defense spending bill, the kind of legislation that cannot fail without triggering chaos, the kind of bill no politician wants to be blamed for sinking. The military budget was held hostage to force this through. That detail matters more than almost anything else, because it tells you this wasn't about persuasion. It was about leverage. The clock was ticking. A government shutdown loomed. The leadership waited until the moment when panic replaces principle, then slid the provision into the package like a blade. This is the shock doctrine applied to lawmaking. For Democrats, it was the perfect outcome. Trump is neutralized permanently without them having to own the political consequences of creating a legislative life sentence. They get the result without the fingerprints. For establishment Republicans, it was an exit ramp, a way to purge the party of its most volatile element while maintaining plausible deniability. They weren't voting to jail Trump, they'd say. They were voting to fund the troops. And Trump's loyalists? They were trapped. Voting against the bill meant voting to defund the military. Political suicide in most districts. The leadership understood this perfectly. They engineered a vote where dissent was impossible, then called it consensus. This is how power actually works, not through speeches, but through bottlenecks. The procedural brilliance of this maneuver reveals something darker. Congress can move with terrifying speed when its own stability is threatened. Centuries of legal tradition were effectively rewritten in a matter of days. Barriers that supposedly required constitutional amendments were sidestepped with clever reclassification. All the gridlock you're used to seeing, the endless debates, the stalled bills, the excuses, vanished instantly. Which raises an obvious question. If Congress can act this decisively to manage an internal political crisis, why does it suddenly become paralyzed when it comes to your rent, your health care, or your wages? The answer is uncomfortable but clear. Dysfunction is selective. When elite power is at risk, the system is ruthlessly efficient. When the working class is drowning, the system discovers process. Now we have to talk about the Supreme Court, because this is where many people assume the story changes. Trump spent 4 years reshaping the judiciary. He stacked the court with conservative justices under the assumption that loyalty would be permanent, that the bench would function as a kind of personal legal firewall. That was a miscalculation. Institutions do not love individuals. They use them. Those justices have lifetime appointments. They no longer need Trump's approval, his base, or his protection. From the perspective of the conservative legal movement, he already delivered what he was brought in to deliver: deregulation, judicial dominance, the rollback of Roe, and the weakening of the administrative state. The transaction is complete. Now Trump is not an asset. He's a reputational risk. By upholding the Executive Accountability Act, or by simply refusing to hear a challenge to it, the court gets to perform independence. They get to cleanse themselves of association. They get to say, "We are not political actors. We follow the law." It's the perfect exit. Loyalty in Washington isn't moral, it's temporal. And once the usefulness expires, so does the protection. But look closely at the law itself, because this is where the real innovation lies. Congress did not claim the power to limit the pardon directly. That would have been an obvious constitutional violation. Instead, they changed the ontology of the crime. The act reclassifies betrayal of the Constitution not merely as a felony, but as a breach of public trust so severe that it exists outside the category of crimes against the United States. The argument is subtle, but explosive. A pardon, they claim, applies to crimes committed against the state. But betrayal of the Constitution is framed as an act against the existence of the state itself, something closer to political apostasy than criminal behavior. That distinction has never been tested at this level. But it doesn't need to be airtight. It only needs to be good enough to survive procedural challenge long enough to do its work. And it did. This is law as engineering, not justice. Now ask yourself, who actually wrote this? Not the talking heads, not the cable news regulars, not junior staffers pulling all-nighters. The language of this bill is precise, insulated, and litigation-aware. It reads like something designed in boardrooms, not committee rooms. It bears the fingerprints of elite corporate law firms, the kind that specialize in insulating power, not democratizing it. Which brings us to the donor class. Behind the scenes, major corporate interests had been quietly terrified of a second Trump term, not because of his rhetoric, they learned to live with that, but because of his unpredictability. Trade wars destabilize global supply chains. Tariff threats spook capital. Alliance uncertainty disrupts defense and energy markets. Capital can tolerate cruelty. It cannot tolerate chaos. And so the signal was sent. Not an order, not a conspiracy. A shift in funding, access, and tolerance. The message was simple. Contain the volatility or lose the money. The Republican leadership didn't grow a spine. They followed the incentives. This was a board removing a founder CEO who had become bad for the stock price. And here's the part that should genuinely unsettle you. They didn't defeat Trump politically in a way that stuck. They didn't dismantle the movement. They didn't resolve the conditions that gave rise to him. They used the raw machinery of the state, to solve a political problem. That tool doesn't vanish now that it's been used once. It waits. And once a tool like this exists, a legislatively defined, unpardonable category of crime tied to political behavior, it will never be dismantled. It will simply be repurposed. The only variable is who controls Congress when it happens again. Now we have to pull the camera back, because if you think this story ends at the gates of a prison, you're still thinking too small. What just happened is not contained within American politics. It radiates outward into markets, currencies, global alliances, and the psychological foundations that allow a complex society to function without constant force. For decades, the United States sold itself as the gold standard of predictable governance. Not perfect, not moral, but stable. That perception is the invisible asset underpinning everything from the dominance of the dollar to the willingness of foreign capital to finance American debt. Today, that asset took a hit. To the outside world, this does not look like a triumphant reaffirmation of the rule of law. It looks like a superpower retroactively rewriting its own rules to neutralize a former leader it could not politically absorb. In other words, it looks like a purge. And perception matters more than intent. Investors, foreign governments, and central banks do not read press releases. They read risk. They look at whether property rights, contracts, and personal liberty are insulated from political retaliation. When they see a former head of state permanently removed through legislative maneuvering rather than electoral defeat, the conclusion isn't moral, it's mathematical. The risk premium rises. We're already seeing tremors in bond markets, not because of this law alone, but because it adds to a growing pattern. American governance is no longer boring, and boring is the highest compliment capital can give. If international actors begin to view the U.S. system as one where power transitions are existential, not procedural, diversification away from the dollar accelerates, slowly at first, then suddenly. And when that happens, inflation stops being a phase and starts being a condition. Your groceries don't get more expensive because of one policy. They get more expensive because trust erodes, currencies weaken, and the cost of importing stability rises. That's the invisible tax of political instability. Closer to home, the damage may be even more severe. You don't have to support Trump, or even tolerate his rhetoric, to understand the danger of what this signals to the tens of millions of people who voted for him. For years, they believed the system was rigged, that elites wrote rules for themselves and enforced them selectively, that democracy existed only within approved boundaries. What happened today didn't challenge that belief. It confirmed it, by removing their candidate through legislative maneuvering rather than defeating him. In a way that settled the question socially, the establishment validated every grievance narrative it claimed to oppose. This doesn't neutralize a movement. It radicalizes it. You don't create reconciliation by demonstrating that participation is conditional. You create a permanently aggrieved political underclass that no longer believes the system has room for them. And democracies do not survive when legitimacy fractures at that scale. How do you govern when a third of the population views the federal government not as their representative, but as their jailer? How do you enforce regulations, collect taxes, or manage crises when obedience is no longer voluntary? You don't. You coerce. And coercion requires infrastructure. This is where the story turns darker. When trust evaporates, the state compensates with force. Surveillance expands. Policing intensifies. Domestic security budgets swell. These measures are always justified as temporary and targeted. They never remain either. History is clear on this. Tools built to manage one perceived threat are eventually turned on others. Labor organizers, environmental activists, protest movements, anyone who disrupts stability. The Executive Accountability Act didn't just incarcerate a former president. It normalized the idea that political conflict should be resolved through criminalization rather than negotiation or consensus. That is a dangerous normalization. There's also a quiet irony unfolding that many Democrats are missing in their relief. This law doesn't belong to one party. It belongs to whoever controls Congress next. If a Republican majority can define executive overreach as constitutional betrayal today, what stops a future majority from defining progressive policy as tyranny tomorrow? Imagine a Congress declaring student debt cancellation a confiscatory act against property rights, or labeling a wealth tax an existential attack on the constitutional order, or framing a public health emergency as unlawful suspension of civil liberties. The language is elastic by design, and elastic laws stretch toward power. Progressives cheering today may wake up tomorrow inside a cage they helped legitimize. What we are witnessing is the slow American adoption of a political model it once condemned elsewhere. In unstable democracies, losing power often means losing freedom. Elections become existential. The law becomes a weapon. Governance turns into survival. This destroys long-term thinking. Why invest in a 20-year infrastructure project if the next administration might criminalize the policy that funded it? Why plan retirement when fiscal rules can be rewritten overnight to punish political enemies? The future collapses inward when the present is ruled by retribution. And then there's the role of media and technology in smoothing this transition. Have you noticed how quickly the narrative stabilized? What would have been unthinkable a year ago is now framed as necessary, inevitable, responsible. The idea of a legislative life sentence is no longer shocking. It's soothing. This is consent manufacturing in real time. The promise being sold is closure. That once this man is gone, the nightmare ends. That the system can finally breathe again. But closure is an illusion. The conditions that produce Trump remain. The economic insecurity, the institutional decay, the hollowing of trust. None of it was addressed. A symptom was removed. The disease was preserved.